welcome everyone to this episode of Deep Conversations. I'm so excited to have my guest, Jason Dukes, with us. Jason is a good friend. We go a little ways back, all the way back to New Orleans. So it's good to catch up with him. It's been a while since we've seen each other, and I'm excited because he's got the Saints on. But what I'm excited about is that he's actually a Duke basketball fan like I am. And so we
Yes.
we kind of have that connection as well. There's few and far between around here for Duke, so we're excited about that. But Jason, thanks for being on today.
Yeah, man. Thanks so much, Guy. I'm thankful to be a part and yeah, we do go back all the way to New Orleans, and you've blessed me. I've even been there in Indianola with you, and I'm trying to remember the name of that restaurant you took me to that was so good, but it was right
Probably
there on the downtown.
probably Nola Restaurant.
Maybe that's what it was. Just trying to remember
Yeah,
the name of it.
yeah.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
All right. Well, we know that this movement of justice has been going on in our country through this time in this year 2020. And so I wanted to chat with Jason about justice from a biblical vantage point because we get inundated through whatever medium it is, whether it's social media, the news, the cycle that we see. We get inundated with these images, ideas, and thoughts about justice. But what does God's word tell us about justice, and what does the follower of Jesus need to know about justice? So as we think about that, Jason, from your vantage point, what's a proper perspective for believers to have a biblical worldview of justice?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'll say I think my I would start it with a disclaimer of um, I think until you've experienced injustice in some way, you probably don't have a well-formed theology of justice,
Mm,
and I think that's why it's difficult for those who are maybe lighter colored skinned
right.
um, to sometimes why we might struggle with this subject matter, because for a lot of us we haven't felt some of those injustices, and
Mhm.
some have. It's not to say that no one has, but sometimes until you felt the effects of injustice, you have a poorly formed theology of it. And so, having said that, um, I would say a proper biblical worldview starts and ends with the same thing, and that is the love and goodness of Jesus.
Mm,
And so when it comes to the gospel of Jesus, it isn't just something that we proclaim, it's something that we also embody. It's not just something that an individual believes, it's
mhm.
something that a collective and a community of people begin to live together. And that's why justice matters, I think, to God, because he really, when God in the Old Testament called his people to do the things that he called them to do, it wasn't only for personal benefit. And over again, he calls to the way that it affects the nations around them. Um,
Mm,
and then in the New Testament, for
yeah.
Jesus to even pray on earth as it is in heaven. And anyone with a biblical understanding of Revelation knows that in heaven there's this beautiful
Right.
aggregation
Hmm.
of people from all tribes and tongues and nations. And so you've got language, you've got color of skin, you've got ethnicity,
Hmm.
and they all are being made into one race, which is what Paul talks about in Ephesians 2.
Wow.
That God, Jesus is building us. That's not the old man, that's not the Jew and the Greek, it's not the free and the slave. It's now one new humanity
Yeah. With a
in
new
Jesus.
citizenship, right?
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think I think I think those things are pillars of it, and then it allows us from there to kind of act on what that could look like in our community.
Yeah. One key thing I hear you saying is that to be set apart for God, whether in the Old Testament or New, if we are set apart, then we are to embody that justice that points others to God.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
great.
It's really good.
That's great. When you think about biblical examples of justice, one comes to mind. And I heard someone share this recently. Esther.
Yeah.
in the Old Testament book of Esther gives us a biblical example of one that she had a different status from her, those that were part of God's people, but
Yeah.
she leveraged that status for the others who were oppressed. So, what might be some other biblical examples that we could turn to when we think about biblical justice?
That's a great question. I think the first one that's always helpful to start with is someone goes up to Jesus and they ask him, "Who's my neighbor?" And he doesn't respond with just a Mr. Rogers song, although I love Mr. Rogers.
Yeah.
He doesn't just respond with a "Won't you be my neighbor? Let's be
Mhm.
nice to each other." He responds by telling a story about blatant racism. I mean, it's a story of a person who is going down the road and is left for dead, and the people who are his own kind don't even help him, but the one that actually is hated by his kind
Mm.
helps him. And it's a very explicit story calling out racism, saying,
Mhm.
basically calling out, and racism may be too maybe some people don't want to use that word there, and
Mhm.
I'm not pulling back, by the way, when I say
And
this.
you're referencing the Good Samaritan as Jesus
Yeah, I'm
tells it.
referencing
Yeah.
the Good Samaritan story, and the idea, and I'm not pulling back when I say we may not want to use the word racism. Let me clarify. I say that because I really do think we are one human race. I think Dr. John Perkins from the great state of Mississippi, or who has ministered most of his life in the great state of Mississippi, now 90 years old. I think he has been quoted multiple times as saying, "Where there's only one race, it's the human race." And
Mm.
so even if you hold to that thought and try to eliminate the idea of racism or language, you still can say, though, that there is oppression and exploitation of other ethnicities, of other people who aren't like you. And that's what was going on between the Jew and the Samaritan, and the way that they had hatred toward each other. And
Mm.
that's explicit story. Jesus responds. And so it's a great example of what justice could look like. In other words, the person who is in privilege ends up being helped by the person who that person of privilege had hatred for. and
Yeah.
and so it really, talk about flipping it on its head. Talk about the kingdom turning, Jesus's kingdom turning things upside down. So I think
Right.
that's one example,
Yeah.
and I would give two others real quickly. One, one from the Old Testament. You see the Ruth story, and the
Right.
way that Ruth, in a lot of ways, becomes someone of minority when she returns.
Mhm.
And yet, in the midst of that story, she not only offers the opportunity for a kinsman redeemer, as the Ruth story tells, but that Boaz then responds to it and gives us a great example
Right.
of what the person in who has significance in that community
Mhm.
does to the person who's very much a minority in that community, and doesn't make them feel like a foreigner or a stranger, which the Old
Yeah,
Testament.
and in that too, we see Boaz following the in obedience to God of in the fields, leaving what's on the fringe, if you will, for those that are less fortunate to gather. So we
Yeah,
see that obedience there as well.
and it's beautiful because it's a progression, right? Like, he's
Mhm.
generous.
Mhm.
And then he's not only generous, he's even more generous. And then he's not only more generous, he even makes his home her home,
Yeah.
right? And his
What hey,
his
what's
family
what's
her
what's the
family.
number one enemy to being generous? What's the number one enemy to being generous?
That's a good question. You may have an answer that you want to say to that, but I mean, I
I mean, I
think the
think we can
number
say
one
the
enemy.
Sunday school answer of, well, the devil's on the road, the devil's out there.
Yeah,
But personally,
yeah,
we're not going to see him like being the obstacle necessarily, tangibly, even though he's behind it. So the spiritual warfare aspect of, what's that number one enemy to me being generous in my life, and that can look different for a lot of people.
yeah. For a lot of people, I mean, I think for the most part, I was actually talking to somebody about this on the call I was just on.
But
And it's the idea that we don't hold them loosely, we hold them tightly. because we really haven't trusted God that He is the giver of all good things. At the core is we fail to understand how generous God's been with us. That's at the core
Hmm.
of a lack of generosity. And so for Boaz, though, to even go a step further, just like Jesus did, and give her his name,
Mm.
right, to
Yeah.
make her part of the family. I
Yeah.
mean, that's an incredibly powerful
Yeah.
example of how far God's justice will go. He gave us his name.
Yeah.
We have a new identity.
Yeah.
Right, because of Jesus, Boaz gives that to Naomi. And then the final example I would give is a little bit of an odd example, maybe to some people, but it's interesting. One of the most quoted chapters of the scriptures for white evangelicals is John 3,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
we'll talk about John 3:16.
Mhm.
And what's interesting is in John 3, we're given the example of a man with great privilege,
Right.
with incredibly significant status,
Nicodemus.
Nicodemus. And yet, in the middle of all of that, Nicodemus's story basically becomes, what do I do when I feel like I might have to give up everything that I hold dear in
Mhm.
privilege, status,
Yeah.
power, reputation, and
Because
yet he does it.
he basically sneaks out in the shadows to go talk to have this meeting with Jesus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And yet we think, from what the early church taught, we think that Nicodemus went all the way. We think that he
Mm.
ends up, we perceive that he ends up being a full-fledged, committed, surrendered follower of Jesus. Well, think about what he lost, right? But I think that's where we talk about the lack of being generous. That's that failure of, he was able to say, I'll let go of all of that for the sake of what going after and going with Jesus will give to me.
Yeah. Wow. And that kind of segues in great examples, but this segues into the next question, which is, what are some specific ways we as believers today, how do we, how does the gospel apply to the way we view justice? We may
Hmm.
have a way that we're viewing justice, but it may not line up with the gospel. So how does the gospel apply to our view of justice?
It's a great question. I'm going to say something that's a little bit controversial, but I'll admit it
Good.
up
Maybe I'll get
front,
more
and maybe
views.
that'll disarm some people. um, it's interesting, but historians, and I will give credit where credit is due on this one particular thought. Alan Cross is a friend of mine, and you may know Alan. He's a New Orleans Seminary graduate. He was a pastor in Montgomery. He's a very well respected historian, very well respected expert on racism and immigration. He's a white pastor. He's now in San Francisco on the Reconciliation Conversation, the podcast that I do with Derek Delane. We've interviewed him recently. It was one of our most listened to episodes. He just did a great job unpacking just the history of religion and racism in the South. And I asked him a question on that episode about the idea of personal relationship with Jesus. Not a bad thought. We have a personal relationship with Jesus. So let me say up front, I'm not debunking that. But I asked him the question, did we let that theology, that idea of the gospel that's so individualistic,
Mm.
did we let that usurp the collective and community nature of what the gospel means to the church as a whole, and to a people and to a community as a whole? And I'll admit that I was asking it in a little bit of ignorance, but more out of, in my own experiences, feeling like sometimes that gets in the way of understanding what the gospel does to us, right? Is
Mm.
we only think of what it does for me.
Right.
And he said back, as a historian, he said well, it's interesting you asked that, because that one of the guys who was a leader with First Baptist Jackson, Mississippi, in the face of the racism of the 50s and 60s, began to tout that this was a personal thing, and that it didn't have to show itself. This was personal. And that theology began to really run rampant through the churches of the South. Again, not bad. A personal relationship is not bad theology, but it's a limited gospel view
Mm.
if I only think about what the gospel does for me. If I don't understand that the gospel is something that's given to us also and affects us and changes us. And when I say us, I'm not saying an us and them. I'm saying
Right.
us as a
As
whole.
as the church.
And yeah, as the
As the
church
church.
and just even as humanity. I mean,
Yeah.
that it says something about each of us that according to Jesus, we're worth dying for.
Mm.
Right. And so it has a collective flow. It's not something where I can a biblical view of justice and a biblical understanding or holistic understanding of the gospel. It moves me to want to see every single person know that they're worth dying for.
Mm.
It moves me then not just to preach that gospel to them,
Yeah.
but to show them that they're worth dying for. And when they cry out, like in the book of Acts, it's interesting in the book of Acts 6, when those widows who were Greek,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
But the scripture does not say that they proved their case and showed historically and beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were getting the short end of the stick.
Mhm.
It really just simply says they felt like they were,
Mm. Yeah.
and they said something about it,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden no one said back to them, well, all the widows matter.
Yeah.
Right? No offense to anyone, this isn't
Mhm.
a an organization.
But in that text, the first, the reaction is serving them.
That's my point.
Yeah.
Nobody says back to them, "You don't matter." All the widows, they say, "No, well, this group of widows
Yeah.
matters enough." They're crying out,
And so
and
service means sacrifice. And
yes,
the core of the gospel is Jesus sacrificed himself.
that's right, and not just for me, but for us. I
Mhm.
mean, 90, according to what a friend of mine from seminary said, 92% of the New Testament is to us. The you in the letters and in the
Mhm.
writings is plural. And
Mhm.
that's significant, right? Because I
Right.
think that forces us to step back and have a more holistic view of the gospel. It's not only what Jesus did for me,
Mhm.
but what he did for us, and then what he's asking us now to do with him.
Yeah, and it's so countercultural because more and more we are more individualistic.
Yes.
So it's very countercultural to consider the us factor as you're presenting it when it comes to how the gospel applies to justice.
Yeah. That's exactly
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Great insight. You mentioned the new podcast
Yeah.
and your friend Derek Delane, right? Y'all started that this year. So
Hmm.
I wanted to highlight that a little bit. I want tell us how that kind of got off the ground, how that got started, and kind of what
Yeah.
you're seeing, from those conversations.
That's a great question. So, some of the people in your area may appreciate this. My dad is from Mendenhall, Mississippi. He ended up serving in Greenwood and Cleveland, and then after that went to New Orleans Seminary, and we ended up in New Orleans. And as a student, he became a pastor of a local church that was mostly black. And so I grew up in a mostly black church, 60% black, 40% white. um, I really genuinely, even though I would go to him to speak at places, Dad always got to speak, Dr. Jimmy Dukes at a lot of places. It still, I don't think, really hit home how unique what I was a part of was, if that makes
Wow.
sense.
Yeah.
And so when I got to college, I think I began to realize, and had some difficult, as a youth pastor, had some difficult experiences in West Tennessee with some racism issues, because of some students that we were ministering to, that the church, some people, not everybody, because the church responded beautifully, but some of our leaders were against, and then they exited, and that ministry continued, and it was a healthy thing. But I say all that to say that up and down and ebb and flow of the black white element has always been present in my life. And so in about 2012, I bought reconciliationconversation.com, really because I not only thought it mattered, I just was surprised that that URL was still available.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So so I bought it thinking, I want to do something with this one day,
Right.
and we'll see what happens. So I say that just so your listeners will know, this wasn't just a response to the George Floyd incident,
Right.
to the murder of George Floyd. And so all that to say, I just had not come across yet, didn't have a piece yet about how to really go at it.
Hmm.
So back in the fall of about a year ago now, almost a year ago now, I just started feeling a stirring, like God's Spirit was saying, it's about time to launch this. A couple months later, I met Derek,
Hmm.
and we became kindred as friends, just as brothers, as fellow pastors, and a lot of ways. And so I ended up saying to him, "Man, I've had this URL and I've wanted to start this thing, and would you be willing to start it with me?" And this was pre-COVID. This was pre the protest erupting. This was pre all of that. So we planned.
This is not an attention grab. It was already in the
Yeah, that's
works.
exactly. This wasn't this wasn't bandwagon. This was, and so we planned on launching it this summer, and then when the protests erupted, we bumped it up about 3 weeks and launched on June 3rd. And so I think we just recorded. The call I was on was a recording for an episode that went long, and it was awesome that it went long, but it went long, and but anyway, and that was the 15th episode we recorded, which
Yeah.
that one will be released here in about 4 weeks. But all that to say, we launched it June 3rd. We've tried to have a mixture of people. I don't mind saying it now because we're already done with the interview. But like one of the episodes coming up is with Jeb Bush.
Wow.
But and so like we've had lots of artists, we've had political figures, we've
Mhm.
had historians, we've had business owners, we've tried to have a real pastors, we've had a mixture of people,
Yeah.
and so we're trying to really just use it as a way to say, we don't just want a great podcast. We want it to catalyze
Yeah.
leaders to say, how do we cultivate for oneness in our communities?
Mhm.
How do we cultivate for a reconciliation? Which, by the way, talk about the gospel. I mean, Paul says the best picture of the gospel is reconciliation
Mm.
in 2 Corinthians 5. I mean, he
And
just
that we're
lays
to
it
we're
out.
to engage in the ministry of reconciliation.
That's exactly right. So the heart behind it is very
I
much
feel like I'm
a,
passing the test, Jason. I feel like I'm getting the right answers here.
you're doing great. You're doing good. So there you go.
Yeah, well, I've seen all the lineup that you got coming up with it, and it's a stellar lineup, and y'all are doing a great job with it. So if you're out there, check out the reconciliation conversation. You'll be blessed by it. We're getting
Thank
close to the end, so just a few more minutes, and I wanted to see, Jason, what one or two resources for the church member or for anyone, what's one or two resources you might recommend regarding biblical justice and even reconciliation?
Yeah, great question. There are a lot of them. The two that I recommend most are, one is a newer resource by a gentleman named Jamar Tisby, but he's president of the Witness, which, if I understand correctly, is headquartered in the Delta of Mississippi.
Really?
And the Witness is basically a representation of Black church leaders, just a communication source basically
Hmm.
for Black church leadership. And obviously it's not just for Black church leadership, it just happens to have its focus there.
Hmm.
But in the spirit of reconciliation, I would hope that we can also humble ourselves enough, as white skinned brothers and sisters, to
Hmm.
know we have things we can learn from anyone of any person of color, whatever their color of skin is. And so All that to say, that resource, Jamar Tisby is the head of The Witness, but he wrote a book called The Color of Compromise. And I think it's one of the best out there. It is a great book on history. It does a great job of challenging the church. And so that's one by a brown-skinned individual leader. And I just give that distinctive only because the other resource is by a white-skinned individual, Alan Cross, who I mentioned a while ago. And it's
Yeah.
his book, When Heaven and Earth Collide.
Mm.
And it's basically, and the subtitle of it, I don't have it in front of me right here, but the subtitle of it is something like religion, evangelicalism, racism in the South, like, and the better way of Jesus. I mean, so like it's a long subtitle, but it's an incredible depiction, incredible retelling of what shaped our religiosity in the South, and how racial tendencies, racist tendencies, were a part of that. So it's not an easy book to read, especially for those from the South who maybe are still struggling. Here's the dilemma. It doesn't have to be your fault for it to be your problem. And here's what I mean by that. EJ Gaines, who's the CEO of Motown Gospel, said that to us on an episode recently. And he said one of his mentors always challenged him, EJ, it may not be your fault, but it is your problem. And what he was trying to say was, you don't need to go get crippled by the shame, but you need to get honest about the issue at hand. And sometimes the issue at hand means I do have fault, right? And then other times it means that kind of I inherited the culture that is the present moment. And so
Yeah.
you may have listeners who do have elements of racism that they need to be honest about and repent of, and ask Jesus to give them a new way and a better way. But you may have those who are not. They would say, I'm not racist. But even if that's what they say, they've lived in the midst of a culture that we've been dominated by more of a white perspective. And so, like those widows in Act 6, let's at least try to understand where they're coming from so we can come together as one body in Christ. And I think that's what Alan's book does well, is it challenges the Southern religious person and says, let's wake up to the better way of Jesus.
Yeah. That's great. We'll link those in the description so it'll be easy for you to find and get those up for you. Great insights there. And I know those resources will be beneficial to all that check them out. But we're wrapping up. And Jason, thanks again for your time. I know you're very busy. Jason has 7 kids, by the way, so he's super busy. Y'all hear me? My church hears me talk about being 40 and having a 20-month-old, and you've got 7 kids. So, I can imagine that schedule. But so we really appreciate it. But as we wrap up, final word, any last thoughts or just final word that you'd like to share?
Man, I will say one thing, and I only say this because it's come out so much in the conversations we've had through the reconciliation conversation. But just a posture of wanting to learn is important. But for those folks who are listening who are theologically minded, if you miss what Jesus is up to, and he talked about it in the Gospels and his teachings, and Paul talks about it in Ephesians 2 when he talks about the new sanctuary that Jesus is building from this new humanity that he's going to put on display, where it isn't all of our various tribes, but one new humanity together. But then you read in Revelation and you see it's his new dwelling, and it is tribes and languages and nations, ethnicities and tongues of speaking. I'm not talking about speaking in tongues, but different languages. Like all of these various elements of tribe and ethnicity and the uniqueness of the individuals, multicolored sanctuary of people. And that's his new dwelling. And so theologically, if you miss that, and you only think about personal evangelism, you don't think about what that leads to, then you miss the beauty of what really on earth as it is in heaven could be. And so I just would encourage your listeners to get the look for the full picture
Yeah.
of what Jesus is up to, not just the personal thing, but the collective as well.
Yeah, the broader picture of restoration, because what you're sharing is the grand story of all of Scripture. Creation, fall, redemption, then restoration, and
That's right.
and restoration of our God is not limited; it's unlimited, and we see
That's right.
that in that picture of Revelation. So, yeah, man, thanks so much for your thoughts. I wish we could go longer. Maybe we can do this again sometime, and appreciate you and what you meant in my life. And I hope that you are blessed right now. And we look forward to hearing from you real soon. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.